Fantasy movies are often perceived as being for younger audiences, but the best R-rated magical films push beyond this conception. These dark and gritty projects are for older viewers and attempt to connect with this target audience by including more intense writing and performances. Since fantasy is a broad genre, the movies that fall within it can deal with magic, mystical creatures, fairy tales, and additional story elements that take audiences to otherworldly places. It's important within fantasy films that take on dark topics for the world building to be just as effective as any other addition to the genre. Movies with an R rating used to have a harsher reputation before today, as more films and projects fall into this category than ever. Plenty of live-action, dark fantasy TV shows have taken the TV sphere by storm, but for a long time, movies were the only place where graphic depictions of sensitive material could exist. A film doesn't necessarily have to be overly violent or sexual to earn an R rating, as fear, language, and other elements factor into how it's rated. However, many films still incorporate these aspects while balancing them with a strong script and moving story. Kate Beckinsale plays a stone-cold vampire assassin in the cult classic Underworld, which follows a centuries-old rivalry and hatred between vampires and werewolves. Though it was critically panned at its release in 2003, Underworld still garnered a few sequels and has carved out a place for itself in the history of vampire stories. One of the most memorable parts of Underworld is the cohesive stylization and moody lighting that lend themselves to the overall atmosphere of the project. Beckinsale's Celine is the protagonist of the film, and she's one of the most lethal characters in the story. Her fight sequences are well choreographed, and Underworld has enough blood and gore to unsettle even the least squeamish viewer. The crux of the narrative sees Celine meet Michael, a human who turns out to be a vampire-werewolf hybrid, and the connection that forms between them. After spending so much of her life reviling werewolves, Michael starts to change her mind, and she re-examines her fight. In one of the movies that defined Keanu Reeves' career, Constantine, Reeves puts a fantastical spin on the action hero character he's come to embody. Also starring Rachel Weisz and Tilda Swinton, Constantine boasts a strong cast of characters who take on the mysticism of the story with serious and faithful performances. Reeves plays the exorcist Constantine, who can see past the veil to witness angels and demons descending to earth. And he uses his gifts to save people, but also to prolong his tragic life. One of the biggest reasons Constantine received its R rating is because of how much the narrative revolves around self-harm and suicide. This, accompanied by the imagery of heaven and hell that are prevalent throughout the story, made Constantine a lightning rod for discussion and criticism. However, over time, Constantine has been reevaluated, and though some of the visual effects are somewhat dated, they're still effective in scaring the audience and driving home the movie's themes. Highlander represents a unique time in movie history for the speculative fiction genre. The 1980s saw an increase in sci-fi and fantasy films as the influx of CGI technology and new visual effects made more experimental ways of filmmaking possible. In Highlander, Christopher Lambert plays an immortal man from 16th century Scotland, Connor, and the story catches up with him, keeping a low profile in present-day New York. Sean Connery joins him as Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez, another immortal who becomes Connor's ally after his arch-nemesis, the Kurgan, tracks him across time. Like so many older fantasy films, Highlander is now considered a cult classic, thanks to Connery and Lambert's great and slightly campy performances. Many of the reasons that critically initially panned the film are why it's so well appreciated today, as its unabashedly joyful and outlandish nature makes it fun to watch to the very end. Chronicling Connor's journeys throughout the world as he ages, Highlander sees the violence and destruction of many ages through the main character's eyes. There are many differences between the new 2024 adaptation of The Crow and the original movie, and all of them point to the fact that the 1994 iteration is better. While the 2024 version might have better and more consistent visual effects, nothing can beat the atmosphere and tone of the first movie, as well as Brandon Lee's unforgettable performance as the Crow. The Crow is an early example of a dark twist in the superhero genre, as after Eric is resurrected, he sets off on a brutal path of revenge. The way the Crow targets his victims and eventually finishes them off is intensely violent, and is what sets the Crow apart from other vigilant narratives like Batman. Additionally, the story's fantasy elements come into play as Eric's transformation into the Crow happens because he was tragically killed and is brought back to ease his vengeful soul. Despite his actions, it's easy to feel deeply for Eric, as he doesn't deserve his terrible fate, and his enemies are far worse than he is. The director of The Northman, Robert Eggers, is well known for his unsettling and sweeping epics like The Witch and the Lighthouse, and his latest film is no exception. Deeply in conversation with Norse mythology, The Northman stars Alexander Skarsgård as a Viking warrior prince, Amleth, whose uncle usurps the king, which Amleth narrowly escapes and vows to get vengeance on his uncle. The story follows Amleth's attempts to reclaim his throne and his learning the truth about his father. The Northman also features Anya Taylor-Joy as Olda, Amleth's love interest, and the pair soon join together to plot against Amleth's uncle and retake control of the land. The brutal and gorgeous landscape of Northern Europe, where the movie takes place, is a stark background for which the violence and atrocities of the narrative are committed. It's not an uplifting or happy tale, as Amleth is cursed by his own vows of servitude to his father, but as an epic, it will stand the test of time. Loosely based on the well-known short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Tim Burton put his unique flair on the tale, which stars a young Johnny Depp and Christina Ricci. Like most works by Burton, Sleepy Hollow is a supernatural fantasy film with plenty of horror elements, making it a gory addition to the genre. Sleepy Hollow also includes elements of crime and thriller stories, as it's up to Ichabod Crane to deduce who controls the Headless Horseman and get to the bottom of a conspiracy. Visually, the film is the perfect thing to watch during the fall to get into the mood for Halloween, as it's scary but has enough intriguing elements that it's not pure horror. Though it strays from the source material, Sleepy Hollow stands apart as its own project, even if its characters are a little underdeveloped. For some of the movie, the audience can't be sure if the terrifying ghost of the Headless Horseman is real or a figment of the town's imagination. But Burton makes sure to immerse the viewer in the supernatural world before long. There are quite a few masterworks of dark fantasy on this list directed by Guillermo del Toro, and each demonstrates why the prolific filmmaker has become inextricably linked to the genre. Ron Perlman transforms into Hellboy, aka Abe, donning prosthetics and costumes that make him almost unrecognizable. Based on the comic series of the same name, Hellboy, the movie follows Hellboy's transformation into an unlikely superhero thanks to his incredible strength and otherworldly powers. Hellboy has gone on to become an expansive universe that includes multiple movies and has become a staple of the dark fantasy genre. Critics and audiences quickly realized that Hellboy was something special and pushed the fantasy genre further in dealing with the darkest parts of human history. The movie's dedication to using lots of practical effects has helped it stand the test of time, and leaning into its more graphic and explicit elements has introduced decades of older audiences to an exciting iteration of the superhero film. Dev Patel's underrated fantasy drama, The Green Knight is an exciting addition to the canon of tales and fables about the legendary King Arthur. However, the film is a twist on the well-known story as it follows Gawain, a knight of the Round Table, as he undergoes the challenge of the titular Green Knight. Thirsting for fame and glory, Gawain accepts the challenge of the Green Knight, unaware that the cost of his notoriety will later be his life. In his search for the Green Knight in his church, Gawain learns a lot about himself and about the true meaning of bravery and sacrifice. The Green Knight incorporates some surrealist elements into the story and the look of the project, making it difficult for the audience to determine what's real and what's a figment of Gawain's imagination. This allows the movie to incorporate violent and intense scenes, making the world of King Arthur feel more rooted in reality than ever before. It might not seem likely that a story about the romance between a woman and a humanoid fish creature would win Best Picture and Best Director at the Academy Awards, but The Shape of Water is much more than meets the eye. Directed by Del Toro, The Shape of Water is one of his most romantic works to date, and is true to the stunning visuals and tragic tone he's known for. Set during the Cold War, The Shape of Water deals with how people faced the repression of self-expression and sexuality that was rampant during this time. Sexual scenes and moments of graphic violence contribute to The Shape of Water getting an R rating, but the movie is most concerned with its tender love story above all else. Elisa and the amphibian man instantly form a connection due to their shared feelings of being outsiders and being ostracized by others. Though the fantasy element puts an extreme twist on this, it's still relatable for audiences and makes it easy to root for the pair to escape their stifling circumstances. Perhaps the greatest fantasy movie of the 20th century, Pan's Labyrinth isn't a fairy tale for children, as the magical aspects of Ophelia's quest aren't the only frightening elements of the story. Set in Spain in the summer of 1944, much of Pan's Labyrinth is explicitly about the Spanish Maquis revolutionaries who were fighting against fascism during this period. Though Ophelia, the protagonist, is young, she comes to understand the villainy at work through the violence committed against the Maquis and the evil of her stepfather, Captain Vidal. Much of the darkness in Pan's Labyrinth comes from Vidal and the horrible crimes he commits against the people who oppose him. The violence shown on screen is part of what gives the film its rating, as well as the fear factor as the supernatural moments get terrifying. In the sequence when the Pale Man chases Ophelia, it's impossible not to be scared. The movie themes in Pan's Labyrinth are in conversation with much of Del Toro's other work, which grapples with how fantasy and storytelling reflect the problems of the outside world.